Hello, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to Stories to Tell. As part of the Chocolate City series here at NYU Washington, D.C. I am Abigail Mata, junior from the NYU Shanghai campus, currently studying at NYU DC, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. So here I'm going to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Tiffany Marquise Jones. She is an assistant professor of anthropology at William Rainey Harper College in Palatine, Illinois. Dr. Jones obtained her PhD in anthropology from the University of South Carolina. However, before that, she received her master's in rhetoric and composition from Georgia State University, where her thesis explored the in-group rejection of African American vernacular English, or AAVE. This research motivated her to pursue a second master's in linguistics and a doctorate in linguistic anthropology at U of South SC. Her dissertation entitled Placemaking Through Performance, Spoken Word Poetry, and the Reclamation of Chocolate City documents the interactive model of spoken word poetry while showcasing her DC poets' performances embody and preserve Chocolate City as well as affirm a sense of belonging that has been threatened by gentrification. So with that, I'll pass it on to our guest speaker, Dr. Jones.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm really excited to get to share some of my work that has been a long time in the making, and hopefully to give you some insights into why, one, I love and will always love Washington, D.C. has a special place in my heart for many reasons, but also to give you some insights into why we should consider DC is still a central mecca for Black arts and for Black culture. And I'll do that a lot through the lens of my research, which is focusing on spoken word poetry. But of course, I will kind of speak to other traditions that are central to the area and how they sort of coalesce and collaborate to respond to some of the infringing gentrification and the erasure of Blackness in the area. So I'm going to share my screen and show a small presentation, and hopefully you can see everything. So one of the things I noticed throughout my work on African American language traditions is a lot has been done, especially within sociolinguistics, about how Black language has been demonized and villainized and positioned as this sort of broken vernacular and sort of like a shameful smudge on American culture that needs to be hidden. And that sort of led me into wanting to kind of learn more about it and to motivate others to understand the language and do so through understanding of what the language does. But in doing so, I wanted to make sure that I got to the creative aspects of African American language, not just go on the defensive as to what the variety is and is not, but to show what it does and how it has cultural significance within its community members. And that led me to looking at a site, obviously what you're here to learn about, which is Washington, D.C., AKA Chocolate City. And having lived there, I had a firsthand knowledge of how plush the spoken word culture was there and how it is, how is the continuation of a lot of African American verbal arts and cultural practices sort of embodied in one art form. I really wanted to use that particular genre to highlight all the things that I think I wanted to say about African American language in general. And doing this work, I kind of saw how they use this language in a very interesting way to kind of to safeguard their identity as being Native Washingtonians, to respond to, again, to microaggressions and to social injustices that wants to erase Black bodies, Black arts, Black language, Black people. And so that's what this presentation is about, is sort of that experience as I observed spoken word there. So why did I want to do spoken word in particular? Again, so I wanted to explore the racist attitudes and language language ideologies against African American language. It's kind of been, again, mocked in the public. If you heard anything about Ebonics from the 90s, and there have been many parodies about what the language does, and you can see here, and you'll see a lot of even appropriation of that language in today's society, where, and we'll see that where campaigns will either try to erase Blackness completely through language, or will appropriate the language in a way that doesn't give credit to those who are innovators of the vernacular and of the variety. So that was my original start to kind of combat this. But also I wanted to kind of show that, again, that there's a long history here of African-American verbal arts traditions, going all the way from the enslaved singing slave songs in the field, doing the ring shout, to the Black church traditions, to hip hop, on down, and in here, spoken word is just a continuum of that. And something that I just want to kind of say for people who don't understand what it is, I'm hoping you do, but I like to, share things through the lens of not assuming that people know what things are. And that is, spoken word is a sort of, it's both obviously poetry and storytelling. So you have this text part of the art form that is written for the stage, right? So it's for the ear. But because of that, there's a large amount of the voice that is involved, inflections, intonations, the speed and the pitch and things of that nature. But also there's in the embodiment, the way that the artist sort of portrays what they're saying through their gestures, through their facial expressions, how they move about the stage and in relationship to the people in the audience. And because there is an audience in the room, that's also expected, as many other African-American verbal arts do, to engage through this method of call and response, where a speaker says something on the stage, and it's sort of like this talk back culture of people in the audience. It's very much an interactive space. And in doing so, it enacts, again, a lot of the traditions that are central to Black culture, but also because of how it's also primed to be sort of like this culture of resistance. It can speak to issues of relevance to Black culture. And in this case, I looked specifically at gentrification, because that was what was being talked about in the area. So one of the things I will say in general, just to kind of give people insight, spoken word in many ways is a continuation of also griotism, and that emerges out of the West African traditions. A lot of the poets that I worked with call themselves modern day griots, and actually one in particular, his name at the time was Real Talk Raps, and now his name is Brandon Alexander Williams. He goes by his government name. He calls himself a modern day griot, and it's important because spoken word is a continuation of not just being a poetic art form, but they're the historians, they're the cultural gatekeepers. They capture and embody memories that are of importance, and they, as any oral art form is intended to do so through speech and verse and rhyme, and pass these traditions and pass these stories on to the next. And so spoken word is something that I see as very important and must be preserved. And Washington, D.C. is actually one of those spaces where we see it preserved quite a bit, and doing so in a very tangible and accessible way that I haven't seen in other cities, especially being a native of Atlanta. So why DC, the original chocolate city? As I said, I am a native of Atlanta, and that's another Black Mecca, and also another area where arts thrives. And it's also an area where it's had its own share of history, being the birthplace of civil rights and having the MLK Center and the home there. But also it's also undergone its own struggles of gentrification, and again, eliminating that history. For instance, like the Falcons built their stadium and got rid of 3 historically Black churches, which was horrible. But when I moved to DC, I noticed that same vibrance, that same richness of Black culture, actually to like the nth degree. Like it was even more accessible. And I sort of got a resurgence and interest in Black arts by being there because it was so prevalent. And also, Chocolate City was going through its own, again, long-term history of gentrification that has been happening in phases, but even more recently in a way that has been threatening. You'll hear like a lot of people talk about the erasure of Chocolate City. And in being there, I noticed though the difference between Atlanta and DC, that there was this public uprising, especially through its art forms, especially through spoken word, that I felt was important to document. And I think that can inspire other chocolate cities. So I was there 16 months between 2016 and 2019 outside of the years I had already lived there. So I'd already lived there as a resident. So I got to know the city first before I was even in grad school. I got to know the city just as a resident, as a transplant. And then I got to know it intimately through ethnographic practices. And while I was there, again, the theme of the loss of Chocolate City kept coming up. And I was there at the height of the Native DC movement that was really trying to embrace nativehood and the Washingtonian spirit. And I'll show you about some other ways that they use the art forms, particularly go-go. I think you had a speaker that really sort of delved into that indigenous art form. It's the one indigenous art form in Washington, D.C. But I will kind of slide through there and really focus on spoken word. So the history and the memory, something I think is very important to note. So one of my key sites, which was Busboys and Poets, is located at the flagship location, because it's a chain now, is located at 14th and V. And that's the flagship location, which is in the heart of the U Street corridor. And the U Street corridor is known as a central arts district. It's very, has theaters, it has bars and restaurants, it has, again, this Busboys and Poets, but, and it also has now the thumbprint of gentrification, the businesses and the high rises and, you know, the residential places that have kind of taken over, and many have kicked out Black businesses and venues. And being in the field, I didn't know this, having lived there, which is really sad, but in walking through this area with one of the poets there, who's named Droopy the Broke Baller, who is a spoken word artist that works for Busboys and Poets as a host, but also has his own open mic series, which I'll come to later. He walked me through the U Street corridor and kind of pointed me to that there was this rich history that was beneath the surface that you could no longer see because of the gentrification that was taking place in the redevelopment projects. And I want to kind of point to that, the legacy of Black Broadway, which a lot of people may not know about. I didn't. And in moving around that area, I started to observe that there were places like the Howard Theater, which is still there. But there's also places like Bohemian Caverns, which was a site where it wasn't called Bohemian Caverns at the time, but it was a site where people like Cab Calloway would perform. And this city, you would see the Black elite, and Duke Ellington was a native of this area, would show up, and people like Pearl Bailey and all of those icons that we associate with the Harlem Renaissance were also here. And up until the 1920s, before it was central to Harlem, the height of Black arts was here in DC. So I think it's important to kind of note that history and that legacy, and why the arts being under threat in this area is very, very important to note, and why it's also kind of heartbreaking to observe, because you have this rich legacy here. And also the same with Langston Hughes, was also kind of noted to come here, who was a native of the area as well. And actually, that's what Busboys and Poets is named after. Langston Hughes was a Busboys before he made it big as a poet. So the owner, Andy Shalhoub, you know, paid homage to him, a DC native and an icon in Black arts, through the naming of that venue. But sadly, what has happened again is toxic redevelopment policies in the area that's sort of stripping that cultural richness, and the arts are still there, and I'm going to get to that, how they remain, but the plushness and the diverse venues and opportunities to observe all kinds, and that were dedicated specifically to Black audiences, it's not, there in the same way. And so a lot of people keep asking, what is happening to Chocolate City? What's happening to the spaces that were of meaning to us? And so sorry, I'm putting my dog down. And so with this particular poem, I want you to kind of observe, I was at an open mic and I thought it was really interesting how she sort of memorialized that loss by saying, rip it apart. It'll stay ripped until you have been removed. Then it will be branded historic, and murals with your dark faces will grace the sides of buildings in name of cultural preservation. So that sort of oxymoron of like memorializing the people you were kicking out, right? Putting iconic figures like the Obamas, like Prince, like Jesse Owens, and so on and so forth on these buildings to kind of capture the essence of Blackness that made Chocolate City great. At the same time, there's this tragic removal of the actual people who make this city great. So I focused in on that as well, because that was a common theme. And just to kind of give you some context, again, what the artists and the art forms were working against, sort of this campaign of erasure, I want to kind of show you what was happening at the time when I was in the field. And then again, that will kind of show why the Black arts and the resilience of Black arts is so necessary to combat these sort of erasures. At the time, I didn't observe this post at first, but I was talking to a DC artist. We were at a space that a theater, and DC is has such a collection of theaters. I highly recommend it when we come out of this Corona haze to get there if you're at all interested in theater. We were at Studio X looking at a play about people protesting in South Africa. And so we were having conversations about protests, and we were having conversations with another artist, Dwayne B., the Crochet Kingpin, who was another part of Busboys and Poets. And he was talking about this post that came out that Muriel Bowser posted in terms of Mumbo sauce. So in the same way that you heard about go-go as an indigenous art form, now there's controversy that Mumbo sauce came out of Chicago, which is where I am right now. So I'm going to be careful. I'm not going to say originated there, but it's definitely embraced and by DC, and it's part of its food culture that makes its way into arts. Artists, narration, they embody it by wearing T-shirts. They bring it up in poetry. They wear the color, Mumbo sauce red, to kind of evoke that symbol of Washingtonianness. And here it is, Muriel Bowser is kind of coming for it and saying like, wait a minute, I didn't think it was all that big of a deal. I've been here, I don't like it. And people clap back, so to speak, and we're just like, wait a minute, Mumbo sauce is a thing. And you'll see this sort of continuation of people feeling like their culture is being infringed on, and then having to clap back and like push against the powers that be, the toxic policymakers, the people who are trying to remove Black culture. Like you'll see that consistent theme. And I saw that while I was in the field. And same way, you see campaign after campaign of people, again, this campaign over here, of white people wearing shirts saying, I'm not a tourist, I live here. Well, that then birthed another clapback in its strongest form, DC movement. And that says, okay, I'm not a gentrifier, I've been here. And so you see this discourse happening back and forth, again, this push and pull of who belongs, who doesn't belong. And you'll see, again, how this informs why spoken word and infusing belongingness is so essential and necessary. So again, we see this sort of toxic infiltration of Blackness in DC. Again, people are coming to the city because of what it means, but are, removing the very things that make it what it has been. So one thing I want to kind of state, if nothing else that I've learned through my research in that area, through living in that area, through immersing myself in the spoken word artist networks there, is that all art forms, especially within the African American language and verbal arts and arts tradition, are preservations of culture. They're performances of preservation, and spoken word in particular, I definitely saw that, and how they use the art form to embody and embrace Chocolate City. And I'm going to give you insight into two venues that I looked at. If you've ever been to DC, heard of DC, and you go there and you drop by, one of the main staples that people would direct you to is Bustin'. It's a restaurant chain, but it's also owner Andy Shalhoub did it to kind of bring arts and politics together. And he did so as an Iraqi American who was at the time, he built the place around 2005, I believe, in response to the Iraq War. So he wanted a place where artists can come and collaborate and talk and commiserate on the things that were happening in everyday life, but also give a place for these performances to thrive and for them to be accessible to other audiences. So this space started out as one in the 14th and V intersection, which is at the heart of the U Street corridor, formerly known as Black Broadway. But now it's a chain. It has 7 locations throughout the Washington, D.C. area, from Brookland to, and some even in Maryland on the cusp of Hyattsville and Tacoma Park, all the way into Virginia and Shirlington. And now their latest one is open in Anacostia, which is a Southeast location. And Southeast, if nothing else, everyone has heard of Southeast DC the same way people have heard about South side of Chicago, or Compton and LA. These places that have sort of these reputations, but he's bringing the arts and doing so in a way that is also letting the people sort of craft what it is in this particular area of Anacostia. He's letting people from that area sort of drive the art form, how it's being presented. So when it was open, Dwayne B., the crochet kingpin, who was born and raised in Southeast, was the first to feature there. They have hosts that were born and raised in the Southeast area, and they're employing people in the kitchen and things of that. They're doing all this really interesting protest work. But this is a place where people come and hear spoken word poetry. They can perform it, whether you're a novice or someone that has a book and you're on a book tour. Anyone who comes from the New York, the Northeast corridor, will stop through Busboys and Poets. If you're a poet in the area, you feel like you have to feature at Busboys and Poets. One artist and any artist I know, please go see their works. LD Kuhn, who grew up in this area, said that it was her dream to perform here. When she featured here, I was there, and it was such pride to be on that stage. So Busboys and Poets is an encapsulation, I think, of a lot of what is happening in the now in Washington, D.C., and trying to preserve the arts of this area, but also to give people who are from this area a place to commiserate. At the same time, it's still a chain and it's still thriving business. And people have said that because it is such a trendy place, it does invite a level of a lot of outsiders or tourists, as I call them in my research, who are not from the area, who are gentrifiers who moves in the area and they're not native to the art form or not even aware of the art form. They're just kind of passing through. So it is a sort of cultural clash zone. It's more of an insular community than it did when it was just maybe one location. So on the right side, what you'll see is another place that is just as key to DC, but it's not as well marketed because it is sort of an underground site. They're doing a little bit better now because they have residents in a theater, another space that I will show is of importance to the area, Woolly Mammoth Theater. And this is Spit Dat DC, which is Washington, DC's longest running open mic. And it had more of an underground feel. It was a grassroots movement birthed from Droopy the Brook Baller, who had been there through his Howard days, who's seen the rise and fall of poetry culture in that area, and who as part of that network wanted his own space to kind of, again, give artists a space to come through, but also to give the locals a place to come and commiserate, to give Black people, whether they were students from Howard or locals, Washingtonians, a space to kind of pour their hearts and their trauma and things of that nature. And you can see it's not all the razzmatazz of Busboys and Poets. There are no lights and there's no high-end, production. But what it is sort of this idea of just like, it kind of reminded me, they called it the spoken word church. It kind of reminded me like a Southern Baptist, like little hole in the wall church with rickety fan. But the soul and the richness of the people and the felt experiences and the emotion was just, it was rich there. So it's spaces like these that make and preserve the art forms, and they do so in different ways, right? Busboys and Poets is on a national um, stage. Anyone who is anyone's been there. I was there. Angela Davis was there. The Obamas ate there. You got politicians, activists, artists of all kinds that will stop through there. And when it comes to Spit That DC, yes, it's not going to be something you find on Google Maps per se, but any artist who is aware, who is coming through that city, this space, will stop through Spit That DC. And it's more insular, but it's just as much of a cultural gem in the area. Now, one thing I noticed too is that because of gentrification, a lot of places were removed. A lot of the venues that were part of the U Street corridor, or AKA Black Broadway, was kicked out. Black owned spaces or pushed out or overpriced in a way that people couldn't hold on to their spaces. That the poets I found had to kind of make use of other sites. And in this case, this is the Keegan Theater, and I witnessed two of the artists that I mentioned already, Droopy the Bookballer and Dwayne B, who are co-hosts of the Spit That DC that I just showed you. They started bringing their art form to the forefront, to spaces that were not traditionally insular, that were spaces where you saw a lot of gentrifiers or transplants frequenting. And they came here and they brought their art form. They brought particular this From Gumbo to Mumbo two-man show that was about pushing back on gentrification and pushing back on owning, I would say not pushing back, but owning their belonging, that they are central to this space and that they won't be removed. And in doing so, they did it in a very interesting way that I think is very central to what I think is so great about DC, is that you can just, again, feel the history of Black culture and the history of Black verbal arts, even in just one performance. They had this sort of, you've seen Family Feud, they were positioned as being part of this game. And they were doing so and saying, playing up on what is called the dozens. And if you've ever heard any kind of Yo Mama jokes, you know what the dozens is, right? So on the left is an example. Yo Mama so dumb, she thought a quarterback was a refund. Ooh, right? Well, they kind of evoked that same premise in this play, but they did so by looking at mumbo sauce, right? What I told you that Muriel Bowser, the mayor, was trying to push aside. And they reclaimed that in this one scene by having one person play like an outsider and the other one say, yo, my mumbo might taste, your mumbo might taste like this, but my mumbo is the real thing. I am the real DC. You might be trying to kick me out, but we're still here. So in this case, you'll see he says, your mumbo tastes like the feds beating the street instead of us beating our feet. And if you know anything about DC, beat your feet is a dance that was native to the area. So these art forms can evoke these symbols and evoke these other cultural performances in a way that I think are rich, and it just shows that it's just always there, whether people are removing or not. It's just always under the surface. It's always being embodied, especially in the artistry of spoken word poetry and in other art traditions. But this was just one example I saw. And what was so fascinating about this is that you had people who were coming in just to see a theater show, had no idea what they were running into, never had seen spoken word before, maybe had heard of the game show, but as non-Black, non-native Washingtonians, non-native to what spoken word is, they were kind of casted in a way that was really interesting. They were positioned as outsiders. They knew the theater mode of performance. They maybe understood the game show mode of performance, but they didn't know the spoken word performance as much. And they didn't know the dozens and what that symbolized. And they didn't know this like Washingtonian discourse, bringing in mumbo, bringing in beat your feet. There were so many symbols that were embedded that you had to kind of be in the know, kind of like what Spit That DC. If you're in the know, you're in. If you're not, you're not. Sort of reclaiming space in a way that was symbolic through showing, again, these embedded frames where you see you're only here, you're the outsider, but those who can make it all the way into the center of what we're talking about embodying, then okay, now you belong. So it flipped what gentrifiers, gentrifiers and gentrification was doing to natives in the area and repositioning them now as the outsider. So through these art forms, artists are able to take over spaces and then use their art forms to reclaim spaces, to reclaim the narrative of what belonging means. And the other thing I will say too that's really central, I noticed in looking at busboys and poets and specifically, is the way the spaces still not only are used to perform Black culture, but made and paid homage to Black icons, to Black arts, to Black history, in the way that people spoke about these spaces, sort of evoked these beings and made them present in the space. So this is an example of Pearl Bailey, who is also someone you would see on Black Broadway, a singer and an icon in her time, won Tony Awards and things of that nature. And she's on every Busboys and Poets place has their own room. An icon has its own room. So you have the Langston Hughes room, you have the Paul Robeson room, you have the Marion Barry room, which is they call him DC's mayor, and you have the Pearl Bailey room. And one of the artists there, who Pages Matam, who's the head of Busboys and Poets, director of poetry events, or the DOPE, he came up and told people that, hey, I need you to perform in a way that makes Pearl Bailey smile. And he, you would hear that often. You would hear almost like these spaces were alive as sentient beings. And it was also speaking about them as these honored elders and these present figures that show, again, that the history that has been attempted to be, that's been erased, that it's still there. The undercurrent is still there. And while you might not see it in the same way as you did in the 1920s, the artists and the artistry and even the murals in these spaces where artists perform are preserving that through the arts, through memory, through storytelling, through poetry. So it's all connected. And then, spoken word is, again, it's just the trajectory of everything that we see in other African-American verbal art traditions, again, dozens being one of them, but also, again, Black preaching styles in the Black church, old Negro spirituals, the ring shout, all of these other performances have been done in more ways than just for the performance sake, right? They've been ways for the practitioners to reclaim identity, to overturn erasures, to preserve their cultural memory underneath the shadows of people who are trying to erase their memories, to erase them, to take them all the way from days of being enslaved up until now, where we might see it happening in a different way, a new age lynching, of police brutality, or of redlining, of housing discrimination, so on and so forth. Performances like spoken word, as it is happening in DC and other chocolate cities, but here in the original chocolate city, is all about that reclamation, all about that battling against erasures and healing the transgenerational trauma as well. But doing so in not just a way that is, doom and gloom, but is inspiring. And that is all about celebrating Black arts and Blackness. So I don't want to end this in any way by saying that, we should hang our heads and just move in a corner inside, because something that I think that is so great about DC and spaces like Spit That, and spaces like Busboys and Poets that you see on the bottom right, they're doing their part, but there are other ways that it has been thriving as well. Again, so one thing I want to bring up is that I didn't get to mention that I thought was really fascinating while I was there. There was a Metro PCS under T-Mobile that was, I believe, in the Shaw district of DC, had been known to blast go-go all day. It was sort of like a beacon of hope to all its people that, Washington was still alive and well. And people were moving in, gentrifying, these spaces. And of course, that comes in with people who are not used to the culture, want to take advantage of the city, but then villainize what the city means, and call the police and have the music stop. Right away, I was so fascinated by this movement. Right away, people came together, organized, and said, no, we're not having this. And they launched hashtag Unmute DC. Highly recommend you look it up. And they had go-go bands come in and perform, and they did a celebration protest in a way that says, no, you're not going to turn off the music here. This is who we are. And because go-go had been pushed to the fringes in other ways, I thought it was very essential to see them reclaiming it in such a profound way. And that immediacy, I think that's what makes DC so special, in a way that I see them fight for that, in a way that I wish other chocolate cities could or would, especially in Atlanta. And that's just one aspect. And even in that From Gumbo to Mumbo show that I talked about, where he incorporated the dozens, he also incorporated elements of go-go by mimicking it with his mouth. He's a beatboxer. And I wish I could show it. I'm coming up on 30 minutes. Maybe if there's time, I can show you some of the clips of the artists there, and one that I would like to show when I wrap up. But there are other spaces as well that this preservation is happening. Woolly Mammoth is another theater I got to work with while I was there and observe Dwayne B. do a show on people infiltrating Blackness. And Woolly Mammoth is a theater that is dedicated to making theater accessible to Black people and to reflecting Black stories in a space that is welcoming to Black people. And I thought that was really great to see, because sometimes it is not seen as an art form that is for us, as us in my community. And for them to have that particular mantra as central to their mission statement was fabulous to see. And Spit That is now taking up residence in Woolly Mammoth. So Woolly Mammoth is also helping to preserve Spit That DC, which I said is this grassroots project movement of artistry. And why it's important is because, unlike Busboys and Poets, Spit That does not have a space that it owns, that it claims. And so it's at the whim of what places are open, and sometimes are kicked out. They're kicked out because of gentrification that's happening. So to see a Black-owned space, paying homage to Black artists and artistry, I just think is another example of why DC is so special. And then lastly, you have the DC Funk Parade. I didn't get to go there, but these poets are always telling me about it. I didn't get to see it before I left, but I'm hoping it will emerge again. And again, sort of encapsulating all that is part of DC culture. And that's what go-go is. It's sort of several arts in one, with funk at the center. So it's there. It's not going away. It feels silent right now, especially because what's happening with Corona. But I highly encourage you to go look at Spit That Digital. They're online right now at Woolly Mammoth Theater. You can go there. I think they do a showing monthly. Busboys and Poets has weekly poetry open mic sessions that are run by different artists in and around the area. So I highly recommend it. One of the women who was a host there is the first poet laureate of Alexandria, Virginia. So I think that's special that they also have people who are breaking barriers as well, even going on all the way down to reflecting issues of the Black, trans, LGBTQIA+ community. But lastly, not least, if you want to learn more about Black Broadway, there is a site called Black Broadway U, and the owner of that site really wants to make sure that she preserves the history of what is now U Street and formerly known as Black Broadway, and showing how it's still a part there. If you go through the city, if you go through that area, you'll see memorialized in the wording and in the imagery around there. There are little bitty spaces that show you, like if you look across the street, you would see Black elite and royalty dressed to the nines, going out for theater, going out for swing dance, and so on and so forth. So it's there. But I just want you to kind of take away from this that spoken word poetry in DC and other African-American verbal art traditions that are, in DC and everywhere else, they do the work of showing that our contributions are here. Our thumbprint on American culture and American history cannot be erased. And spoken word poetry is just one of those other places where we're seeing it being taken over and incorporated and reproduced in other environments, non-Black, outside the US, so on and so forth. So I love that Washington, D.C. is one of those sites that kind of show where people of all races, of all genders, of all backgrounds flock to the area to kind of see it thriving in its own space. Yeah, so I'm gonna stop right there. If I have a minute to show a video, I will, but I just wanna say thank you to all the people who've helped me with this research, the American Anthropological Association, Russell J., Dorothy S. Belinsky, the Institute of African American Research at USC, the Spark Grant, my research committee, my participants in Chocolate City, and thank you so much for listening. I hope I've given you some insight and will inspire you to go and see for yourself whenever you can. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Jones. You do have a minute, actually, if you would like to share that video.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I actually, I have a couple, but I'm just going to show one because I think this speaks very shortly and concretely to what I observed while I was in the field. And this happened at Spit That DC. And it was, Abigail, can you see the YouTube?
Yes.
Okay, great. Just want to make sure. This happened at Spit That DC before it was displaced. And this place was in an area owned by a Black woman, Sylvia Robinson, who dedicated this space to preserving Black culture and Black arts. But she had passed, and the new board taking it over and displaced Spit That DC. And they have been displaced before several times, sadly. But they found residents in other places, Woolly Mammoth being one of them. But before they got displaced, this is what was called the spoken word church. And you'll kind of see in this clip the reverence, but also, again, how people speak to the transgenerational trauma and also call out some of the issues like gentrification that was happening in the area. So I hope you can hear this, and I hope it helps make sense of what I got to witness while there.
Gentrify laundry. Separate clothes, whites from colors. No mixed matching, never blend. Fill machine with hot water. Add whites. White. Well, spin cycle, hang to dry, white sheets in the wind, cool, crisp, privilege, full of life. What's up, Spit That?
Did you get to hear all of it, Abigail?
Yes, we did. Yeah.
Okay. So this was just one, this was Spit That, and this is C. Thomas. And again, he spoke on how to gentrify laundry. Again, sort of like just an encapsulation of how many times I saw poets use their art forms to, again, push against the dominant culture that was seeking to take over. And if I have one more second, I'll just show you a clip from Gumbo to Mumbo. These are things that I've filmed myself, so I'm sorry the volume quality is low, but you'll get to kind of see how the dozens is played out in a way within this performance, but also utilizing spoken word and hip hop and the discourse of Washingtonian, Native Washingtonian life within this, hopefully, 2 minutes.
Gumbo tastes like Bourbon Street curfews. All wafer thin, watered down and whitewashed. Like folk-free yet funky tourist tuna fish swimming with Gentry. Like post-Katrina carpet ragged colonizers who were just off pointers, expecting it to be noiseless. Well, my mumbo tastes like a song you just can't get out of your head. It's like, at Easter Motors. T-shirts, sweatshirts, footwear, and boots. And he's like, Southeast, Southeast. It tastes like the homegrown soundtracks of my overnight area. Your mumbo tastes like shady cops with clear intentions. See, the jump house got me about 2 weeks ago. And nobody seen Bebe since he moved up north. And I heard Langston Hughes and Woodland still beefing. And they across the street from each other. See, my mumbo, they taste good. Your mumbo tastes like the feds feeding the streets instead of us feeding our feet.
I don't know if you got to hear all of that. I know it's kind of unclear, but one of the things you might have heard him when he was making that go-go beat, right? That's what I was talking about. And if you could hear the people's reaction in the background when he was saying Southeast, the Southeast, sort of evoking that go-go track. Again, it's sort of that vibe that's in the air that gets evoked through these cultural preservation performances, like what I observed. So I hope that's just a nugget of what is so special about the area, what's so special about these artists, and what's so special about the art form. So I'll leave it there, and then if you have any questions, feel free.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for that presentation. It's very insightful. I do have a few questions here for you. Okay, we'll start with, I guess, how have you seen the energy and community around spoken word sustain in this new digital world? I know we touched on a bit about that, but if you could just expand more.
Yeah, I actually, the artist that did How to Gentrify Laundry, C. Thomas, he actually had an online open mic, and it was, the one that I went to was on LGBTQ and Black love and things of that nature. And all the artists, if you go to the Busboys and Poets website and you see the hosts that they have, all of them are working artists, and they might have their own open mic series and things that they're doing online. And something that I did not think it would be possible to preserve the richness of spoken word poetry in a virtual space. But I think what we're finding in times of Corona is out of necessity, right, comes invention and creativity, and people are using Zoom spaces in the same way that we're doing here to do some of the same things. So where you might snap, in person, you can still do that if I'm on mute. It's still there. And then you'll see people in the chat saying like, yes, honey, doing the talk back that you would expect in those places. And, other kind of call outs, like, I wish I wrote that. And things of that nature. So I think what is still possible, they're making use of that. And you'll see with the Woolly Mammoth space as well, they have that monthly virtual space. I don't know how free flowing it is, where you get to just come and sign up and pop in, but I do know I see working talents that have like a long reputation showing up at these virtual open mic spaces. But definitely take a look. I mean, they're out there, and if you start with just the ones that I mentioned, like I said, with Spit That DC, with C. Thomas, I'm trying to think of others that I have seen. But other poets that I can call out in the area, Rebecca Dupas, who's a woman, a Black female writer there who is awesome. I know she's had a woman, female identifying series that's like woman empowerment. Definitely look her up. But I tell you, it's one thing that they have shown is that they will not let the issues of politics, of a virus, or anything else of gentrification stop the art form. So it's out there.
Yeah, I agree for sure. I know Charlene has been putting links in the chat for those who might be interested in.
Thank you for that. Charlene. I appreciate that.
And then the next question would be, I guess, in what ways are other chocolate cities in the US communicating or collaborating with one another? and if they are to celebrate Blackness and Black arts?
That's a good question. Coming from Atlanta, I actually wish we would collaborate more with Atlanta. I do see collaboration between its artists, like Real Talk Raps. Oh no, I just saw in the chat that when I muted, I'm sorry that I cut out the C. Thomas, How to Gentrify Laundry. If there's time, I'd like to play it again because it's so meaningful. And plus, he's been so central to my research. I want to give him that little shout out. But Atlanta artists and other cities like Philadelphia, Chicago move quite a bit through each other. And there's one particular, I can't think of it. It's like a youth spoken word or youth slam series. Oh, I can't think of it right now. But I noticed that they'll go back and forth between like the different chocolate cities and other places where they're a thumbprint of spoken word artistry. So, and when I saw it, the first time I saw it, first time that it came to Atlanta, the DC Youth Slam team was there, people from Chicago were there, people from Philly were there. So there is a sort of network that's happening between them that sort of keeps this plush network sort of open and accessible all around at least the Western corridor. And I'm sure there's sites like that on the West Coast as well. And now, in terms of the activism perspective part of it, I do hope that in doing this research, and what I want to do is turn this into an ethnographic film so that other chocolate cities can draw, if nothing else, inspiration from that and to maybe start conversations, because I do think there's something that's special about, again, that immediacy and that urgency that I wish we could see here in, say, Chicago. Like I've heard some controversies come out about how much resources are offered to non-Black people in Chicago, but you know, this is traditionally a chocolate city and not that same amount of resources. And there's sort of this sort of sadness that seems to be, you know, in the city, or hopelessness that sometimes seems to be here in the city. And the same thing with Atlanta when the 3 Black churches got taken over by the Falcons. You know, there was not that uprising that I thought. So I'm hoping through a conversation like this around urban spaces and urban art forms and the artists and Black artists in that area that we can start more of that collaboration and conversation.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that answer. I'm actually a Chicago native myself.
Oh yeah?
And yeah, I'm by like the west side of Chicago. And I mean, personally, like sadly, I know like I have never really heard about the movement in Chicago. So that like what you said, it's really interesting. And there's actually a question about that an attendee asked if there are any places in Chicago that you would actually recommend to kind of get more informed, if there are any, about like the movement.
So you know what, I'll be honest. I was so set to hit the ground running when I got this job in Chicago and to like dive head first in the spoken word venues here. And I don't know this area as well from a spoken word standpoint. I do recognize that Chicago, you can't, when you think of any kind of place that's central to arts, Chicago's definitely up there. And honestly, what's funny is the movie that kind of did this resurgence of Black arts and particularly spoken word poetry. If any of you have seen Love Jones, this came out of the 1990s, which was a rise of Black cinema. And Love Jones was about these 2 figures, and it was a Black man and a Black woman, and Black man was using spoken word poetry to woo his love interest. And this was happening at an open mic cafe, and it was located in Chicago. And I remember always kind of wanting to get here because I had heard that it was so available in this area. And at that time, I was just a young 15-year-old. I didn't know how, you know, how I was going to do this work later on. But Real Talk Raps, who I mentioned earlier, was also homegrown to this area as well. And I know he says that anyone that needs to perform and get their chops in the art form has to come to Chicago. It's like one of those places. So I know it's here. If you want, and this is a project of mine, on my website, which is my whole name, TiffanyMarquiseJones.com. I'm going to start paying homage to spaces in Chicago. That's my mission, to kind of highlight what I observe in DC, observe it from a first person perspective here in Chicago. And I'll start to kind of document, because one of the things I want to do is create what's a spoken word archive. And show, have people in their own words who are practitioners of this art form give their oral histories about the history and how it has emerged, but also highlight the places and the spaces where this art form is still very prevalent. So that's coming.
Okay, great. Looking forward to it when I get back to Chicago.
Yes, look me up. Look me up.
Yes, I will, definitely. The next question, I guess it kind of relates to how you were talking about the controversy in Chicago about other communities not getting resources, but in terms of DC, an attendee had a question that says, do you think that other POC populations such as Hispanic and Latinos could assimilate into the DC culture?
Oh, definitely. And I wouldn't even just say assimilate. They thrive there in their own way. I'm so sorry. I have a dog that keeps hopping in and out of my lap. I have noticed that there's research, and I forget the name of her book. Maybe Charlene can help me. But her name is Gabriella Modan, Modan, and she writes on particularly on the neighborhood, I think it's Columbia Heights neighborhood in Washington, D.C., and how the Latino community, the Latinx community has set up shop there in a way that they sort of own their Latinness, but then own their sort of roots. Turf wars, thank you so much. Own their connection to DC culture, and they actually use stage and stage plays and other performances to kind of show their own sense of belonging in a way. So it's different where the Washingtonians, the native Washingtonians who are Black, used it to kind of show like, hey, we built this country, you know, our ancestors actually had laid brick and mortar on the Capitol where you sit and, you know, watch down from your tower. You know, the enslaved here, the presence of that is still very much embedded in here. And so they're mapping it onto this long trajectory and this long history, where in the Latin community, they're looking at it in terms of how long have you been here and how involved are you in this? So you get belonging through action. Whereas with DC, Washingtonian natives, you get belonging because you're here, right? It's just a different spin on belongingness and the identity of being a Washingtonian. But yes, that's just one example of Gabriella Modan's work that I looked towards that focused on Latinidad in the US and in particular in DC. So I highly recommend that read. And it's very accessible. It's not, sometimes linguistic anthropologists or urban studies will be high up in the heavens. You're like, I know I read English, but what was that? I think her text is definitely something that I would recommend to even people outside of anthropology.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much for that recommendation. Another question that we have is, how can, again, comparing, I guess, DC to the other cities, how can residents and artists continue to amplify DC's Black Broadway so that DC is among one of the cities throughout of when students and professionals want to further pursue the arts, like we talked about New York City, LA, and Chicago?
Well, one thing I saw when I was in DC, that sometimes I was a little bit frustrated by, it was very insular in the sense that sometimes it didn't always make its way to the broader public and to the broader public discourse of, I mean, everyone knows that DC is a predominantly Black city and that it does have a rich cultural arts, but to what degree, I almost feel like you just have to be there to really get it. And so you're right, it does need to do a better job of marketing, because I was looking at something like, even when I was kind of trying to position how the cultural symbols are so important. When you look at places, say like New Orleans, right, we are so aware of the cultural symbols there, like the food culture, the music, the jazz is so central to that, right? You know that, and you don't even have to have stepped foot in Louisiana, right? It's kind of out there, it's marketed in a very accessible way. And with DC, like when I moved there and when I learned about how accessible the arts form was and how it was not always the case. The people there, they actually thought that was the norm. Like, if that makes sense, the Washingtonians that I had come across, they thought that, oh, they were like, what do you mean you've never been to a spoken word cafe? You're from Atlanta, right? They didn't realize how special it was what they had there, and that it was rare. And I think coming from Atlanta and coming from what was the second richest Black county in the nation at the time I grew up, which is DeKalb County, now sort of a center of politics because Georgia turned blue, because of a large part of that county. And then going to Washington, D.C., which was the first rich Black county, which is PG County, in that area, we kind of live and thrive in a bubble. We think that most Black people live that way. I think sometimes we forget that these spaces aren't as available and accessible. And even like the Pretty Girl County, and even the ability to fight and to organize, right, and to gather is not as, I didn't see that, for instance, in Columbia, South Carolina, and it was kind of sad. So I do want Washington, D.C. to sort of get its props and to kind of, toot its own horn, beep, beep, and say, like, this is what we have here. I think they have to kind of know how special it is. And it was funny, one of the artists, Droopy, that I talked to was like, thank you for doing this work. Cause he said, I reminded him that it was necessary and important. I think when you're on the inside, you forget, you don't really know the impact it has. So that's why one of the things I want to do is that spoken word archive, and to highlight it in the movie and memorialize it through their own oral histories, so that not only that it gets out there, not in my words, but in their words, but so that they can also have something that they see is something to be proud about and to celebrate, and to really, like you say, amplify that. So I'm right there with you. It needs to happen.
Yeah, and and speaking of that, do you like anticipate new spoken word and art venues popping up in DC to kind of further, I guess, get it out in DC in the near future, or like more of an effort to support and like amplify existing venues like the Howard Theater and the Busboys and Poets?
It's always there. And Charlene, if you want to put the other poet who's part of Spit That DC is Dwayne B, the Crochet Kingpin, I think is his website. And then the director of poetry events, and I can type it as well, is Pages Matam and Rebecca Dupas are some others there if you want to check them out. But I think they're thriving there nonetheless, even if they're not marketed in the same way that Busboys and Poets is. I mean, Busboys and Poets has a loud sound. It's made noise in a way because it's a chain and it's owned by a restaurateur who is central to being part of DC nightlife and restaurant life there. So he's able to commodify and commoditize in a way that other smaller venues haven't been able to, but it's there. You just kind of have to know where to look for it. But I do think that it's hard because gentrification, what's happening there is there's this push-pull of how artists can still own spaces and still thrive where you have wealthy developers, wealthy transplants taking over. So I think that's what we're seeing right now is that struggle, but it's always going to be there. I don't think they're going to run this out anytime soon. And I also think that artists there are finding new ways, like I was saying, by taking residence up in Woolly Mammoth Theater to kind of show that it's still around and still available and market their smaller spaces. So I see that we're at a few moments away from closing, and I was prompted to kind of give some closing remarks. And I did want to read something, but I'm not going to read it because I think I can just say it. If nothing else, I want to say how special it was for me to kind of see these artists do what they do up close and personal, and to do it in a city that is surrounded by Black history, that's surrounded by the thumbprint that we have on this country, on American civilization, but also on American art forms and on even of the language that we speak. spoken word now is being reappropriated and recontextualized across the nation. And DC is one of the spots that is introducing a new generation to this art form, those outside of Black culture, to Black voices, to Black artists. And so I think it will always be special in that way. And I'm just so thankful that I got a chance to observe it for as long as I did, and now to hopefully preserve it through my work, and point you back to the people that are doing this work on a day-to-day basis. I'm just a visitor. So please go and patron the arts, patron Black artists in DC and beyond. But thank you so much for inviting me to convey my time in Chocolate City.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for joining us today. Yeah, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
You too.